Hey everyone, before we get into another episode of the Falconry Chronicles podcast, I need to give a quick shout out to one of the sponsors and supporters of the podcast, being the Archives of Falconry. Located in Boise, Idaho, the Archives of Falconry is the leading steward of global falconry heritage. The Archives collects and preserves falconry heritage and the legacy of individual falconers, including their correspondence, memorabilia, art, literature, crafts, and life stories. The Archives also interprets falconry history and celebrates the role of falconers in the birth of raptor conservation. Visit falconry.org and become a member today if you haven't already. And now, on to this next episode of the Falconry Chronicles podcast.
This may be a little bit of imagination, but I could swear I could hear him coming from the sky. I could hear this, and by golly, he came out of from a place out of sight. So he had to be up above where gulls go, and stooped down at this lure that I was luring with. And the noise that he made as he went past my ear, he didn't hit the lure. I pulled the lure away, and he went past my ear and turned and went back up, and he went up probably 400 feet.
Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome back for another episode of the Falconry Chronicles podcast, and this is another lengthy one. It's a doozy. I'm just going to give you a heads up in advance here, but I think you all will really enjoy it. There's a lot of really good information in this episode, and for those of you that are book collectors or read a lot of falconry books, you all might recognize the name of the guest for this episode, being Clayton White. He is the author of Peregrine Quest, and he's one of the co-authors of Peregrine Falcons of the World, and he is a wealth of knowledge when it comes to peregrine falcons. And personally, I don't know very many people that have done as much research or been around the world as much as Clay has, so it was really nice getting a chance to pick his brain and talk about all kinds of different aspects of research behind peregrines, and also just some of the different things that he's been able to do throughout his life. So this was an awesome conversation that I got to have, and I'm really happy that I get a chance to share it with you all. So without going on any further, I will just go ahead and let you all hear all the things that I got a chance to discuss with Clayton White. So get comfy and enjoy. Here we go. Yeah, I just want to start off real quick by, saying thank you again for making the time for me to be able to come down here and take up part of your afternoon. I mean, I know you've had a busy couple of days, and speaking of which, I just want to say again, happy belated anniversary, and
thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. So did you do anything fun yesterday at all, or?
Well, we did what my wife wanted to do, and so we're going to take off this weekend. And we're going to go up to Colville, Utah, and just rent a motel up there and fiddle around up there. It's good country. It's good country to be in.
Okay.
So that's what we're going to do on this weekend.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, just otherwise though, you just pretty much did typical, dinner and
well, and she had a meeting. We had a guy who's a doctor actually come in and talk to us about air pollution. I don't know if you know that Utah has some of the worst air in the United States, and Salt Lake City has really bad air, and it's really created a lot of problems for Utah residents. And we went to a meeting with where her friends were, a lot of her friends, and listened to him talk. He was there for about an hour talking about what we can do as active citizens and so forth. And so I was glad to go to that because that's something she wanted to do. So that's what I did for our 65th anniversary.
65 years.
65 years.
65 years. Wow. Yeah, no, I when we talked about doing this the other day on the phone, we were kind of talking about, just some of the hurdles and all the different trials and tribulations and 65 years. I commend you on that. That is a very long time.
Well, but it hasn't been all good, It
never is.
Yeah, but I mean, a lot of it could. My brother's been through, I guess he's on his fourth wife now. And I'm happy with this one. I don't think I would want to change it. When I first saw her, I was actually smitten by her when I first saw her, and I'm still as smitten as I was then.
Well, so, that's good.
That's been good.
Yeah,
that's been good.
Yeah, I mean, and as I told you the other day too. I mean, I'm 18 years in now, and it's just there's never all good. I mean, whenever you have to compromise and do all these different things to try and keep someone else happy for all those years, it's theoretically impossible.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And what is interesting is I can turn her off and not know even what I did. I mean, I can say something and I can see her look at me like, boy, shut your mouth, fella, and I don't know what I've even said. So it is something like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like I said, anybody that's been in any kind of relationship for longer than about, I don't know, like 10 minutes.
Or 15.
Yeah. I think it kind of has experienced that. And to be fair, it can happen both ways.
Yeah.
We're not going to sound completely biased here because it's two guys talking on this podcast. But yeah, no, it's sometimes it's hard, finding ways to stay happy and to keep each other happy. And like I said, I mean, hats off to you.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah.
And congratulations on.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Yeah. And you said, so how big is your family?
I have 5 children.
Oh, man. Yeah.
And you got to remember, though, I'm 88, and people of my generation that came after World War II, we didn't really sense like I do now. I'm really death on human population growth as a biologist. And yet, right after World War II, that didn't seem to be a big issue. And I got married in 1958.
Mm-hmm.
And my good friends, I don't know if you know the name Richard Fyfe, F-Y-F-E, he was the guy in Canada that released all the peregrines. He was the peregrine breeder in Canada that ran the government program. He had 5 kids. Walter Spofford, who you may not know or may know, he was the guy that found peregrines breeding in the swamps in Tennessee and these big tall cedar trees. He had 5 kids. But he's about 3 or 4 years older than me. Tom Cade had 5 kids. And it seemed like that 3 or 4 or 5 was the average family size, and I guess she's just extra fertile. How does that go? So anyway, yeah, I have 5 children. I have one son who is 64, who spent 20 years in the military. I have a son who, when we were at Cornell, fell out of our barn, hit his head on a stanchion stall, fell down out of the loft. I have a son who sells real estate, and I have a daughter who is married to an entrepreneur who's got more money than I will live. I couldn't even write down the amount of money on a longhand how much they have. So I have some kids that have been really successful and some that have just kind of gone through life and didn't roll with a lot of the punches. So anyway.
Yeah. No, I imagine that, the more kids you have and the bigger your family gets, the bigger the percentage odds are of not everybody always, turning out super successful or having like these illustrious careers or anything like that. I mean, yeah, I mean, well, and I know that the older generations and, for the most part, especially when it comes from, I don't know, from the perspective of, say, rural families and farming families and stuff. And yeah, I mean, it's back in the day, you needed more people to be around and help out. And, things were just different.
Yeah. Well, and my wife grew up on a ranch out in northern Utah. It's probably the most remote, one of the more remote towns in Utah, called Grouse Creek. And all of her relatives and all of their families were all farmers. And, they had 4 and 5 and 6, 7 kids. They had to have those to make the farm go.
Exactly.
And the unfortunate thing is, as they have gone broke, which a lot of them have, the community now has probably only 25 families in it. We have a home there that was built in 1889, beautiful old stone house. And since we moved back to Utah, we moved back here from New York in, I guess 71 or 72. Since then, we've seen probably half the community go broke, and they sell to a guy named J.R. Simplot. I don't know if you know the name Simplot, but he's the guy that furnishes all of the potatoes for the hash browns that McDonald's uses, and that's why their hash browns are also uniform. They're all russet potatoes, and most of them come out of Idaho, and J.R. Simplot's the guy that furnishes all of those. Well, he's bought up all of the land so that he can have the water rights. So it's the whole character of where we moved. When we came back here, and I first went out there, I thought, this woman is crazy to live in a place like this. But anyway, she grew up in a ranching family, so we spend a lot of time out in our country home. Got a lot of antiques in it, and that's a beautiful old two-stone house, two-floor house with stone. It's the kind you'd expect to see colored glass windows in, which there are not, but that's what you would expect.
If you ended up having to move back out here, and it's important that you're happy, with an area and you live there, and or at least find ways to, at least compromise to the point where even if it's not the place where you can 100% picture yourself or always picture yourself being, you find at least the positive aspects of it to be in.
I was born up in Afton, Wyoming, which is on the western edge of Wyoming. It's on Highway 89, and if you follow that up, you go into Jackson Hole and Yellowstone Park. So that's the country that I came from as a young boy. And so I'm used to that kind of country, and I'm also used to this kind of country that we're in here. With the schooling, I taught at University of Kansas as an instructor for a while, and then I was at Cornell as a research fellow for a while. And it was kind of a cultural shock to move back into this country. And I'm here primarily simply because of my wife's family. I have no family. My parents died when I was 22 years old. So, and I have one brother, but he was living in Samoa. He was teaching school and doing something in Samoa. So I've just kind of had to pull myself up by myself with the help of my wife. And so I kind of go where she wants to go. And she likes it here because all of her family is within, probably a 5-hour drive from here. So it's good. It's good.
Yeah, well, I mean, I admire that too. I mean, it's always nice when at least one person is willing to compromise to that point where it's like, I don't really care where I am as long as I'm, with you or whatever. And
well, and the interesting thing is that I spent so much time away from home doing research with as a university professor. I was expected to do good research, honest research, and not only do it, but publish it, and publish it in leading journals. So part of my salary was dictated by how much research I did and how much I published. So I was gone an awful lot. It wasn't that I wanted to go a lot, but the things that I've been able to do have been very, very, very satisfying.
Yeah. It's the silver lining of not always necessarily living where you want to be.
Yeah.
I've experienced that a lot the last 4 years myself I never really pictured myself living in southern Indiana my whole life. I tried to get out for a bit myself and did for a very short amount of time, but now I've married, into a situation where where I'm probably never going to be able to move, So it's one of those things where you either need to find some other kind of balance, or like either a situation like yours where you're having to travel a lot for work, or to get out occasionally and kind of spread the wings, so to speak. Yeah.
Well, in fact, that being gone a lot had a lot to do with the fact that I wasn't able to do falconry the way it should be done. I flew a lot of birds. I've flown a lot of peregrine falcons and a lot of prairie falcons and falcons, but they've primarily been at the lure, because as a young kid, I didn't have any way to get out in the really far away where there was a lot of game, where I could leave my home in the 50s. I could ride my bike out, and I could maybe get a meadowlark or a mourning dove or something like that. But I really wasn't very successful at it. And then being gone a lot, as a graduate student in college, I got a job at the medical center as a diener. A diener is a guy that, well, that's a German word for servant. And so I was kind of a servant. I did all kinds of things, and I was on call to do autopsies, so that if I were home at 4, I had to be on call from 4 o'clock until 10 o'clock, and I couldn't go and fly a falcon at 5 o'clock, because if they called me, they wouldn't get me, because in the 50s and 60s, we didn't have phones you could carry in your pocket, or a phone like we have today that will fix your dinner for you and it'll give you a bath, and whatever you want the phone to do, it'll do for you. Well, then we didn't have it, and I was did autopsies, and I was on call, and probably 50% of the nights we had an autopsy to do. Somebody would get killed in a car accident, or I remember one woman walked off the bus at the bus station in Salt Lake and fell over dead. And Utah had a law that if you died unaccompanied, so that if there was not a physician around, you had to have a mandatory autopsy. And this lady, we couldn't find. I spent probably 5 hours with the pathologist trying to figure out what had happened. And finally he said, well, Clay, what you got to do, you've got to get a better blood sample. And so I would massage her heart and do all kinds of things, and finally got enough. And it turned out that she had died of tertiary syphilis. Well, you can't pick that up. There's nothing in the body that tells you that this woman had had syphilis, but she died of tertiary syphilis. Well, but I spent like 5 hours that night going through all of this stuff, and so that would make this sport of going out and flying a falcon make it really difficult, and so it became too difficult to do it, because she worked full time. She worked in an insurance agency, and we'd take the kids to the babysitter, and then she'd have to pick them up at the babysitter and bring them home and feed them, feed 3 children, and then get them ready to go to bed and get them in bed. And then if I got home at 10 o'clock, why, that was pretty good for me. So that put a real glitch into what I was able to do. And so when you called me to ask me about, that you were was talking with falconers and interviewing on falconers, I really only ever practiced that from about the time I was 13 or 14 up until I was 35, something like that.
That's still a nice chunk of change there, though. I mean, for years of practicing, though. I mean, that's...
But it wasn't, it wasn't one of these things where you go out and you kill something. In fact, I remember I was really quite disappointed, and I won't use any names here because there are people who would know these guys. We had a guy that lived in Salt Lake that had friends back east, and he invited them out. They were falconers. And I went out with them because I was really impressed with these guys. They were big hotshots. And we approached the pond, I remember, and he had I don't know if it was a peregrine or what it was, that he had, but a coot flushed off the pond. And he threw the falcon off his fist like you would a goshawk, and it went out and killed this coot. And then he said, that's 5 for today. And that meant he killed five animals, but I don't know how he did it. And I was so disappointed. I was really the wind was taken out of me. I thought, this is not what I thought this sport of kings was all about. And that had an influence on me. And it probably shouldn't have had, but it did.
Well, I mean, that was a much different era. I mean, it was still so early. There weren't any rules and regulations still at that point, probably, and stuff either, right?
You didn't have to have a permit.
Yeah, there was nothing really. I mean, it was still so much in its infancy at that point. I can imagine in our country. I mean, I can imagine. There's not very many resources. It's really hard to get in touch with other people, learn about it, and see it. I can imagine that probably would have compounded things a lot more in your mind as what this was supposed to be. And I can understand why you would be disappointed.
I was too idealistic. And it's because I had read this article by Luis Agassiz Fuertes, The Sport of Kings, in the National Geographic, and I thought, this is really, really great. And I remember when I found the first peregrine eyrie. In fact, as you look out my window and look at those mountains just to your east, there are 5 eyries in those mountains in about a 15-mile distance. And I didn't really know where to go and look for peregrines. But when I found the first one, I thought, well, I wonder if I need to get a permit. So I went to Fish and Game and said I wanted to get a duck hawk. Do I need a permit? And the guy said, what do you mean, a duck hawk? And I said, well, it's a peregrine falcon. Oh, one of those chicken hawks. He said, well, I don't give a damn if you have a permit or not. Go in and get the damn thing if you want, And so that's kind of my experience as a young man back in the 50s. So, everything has really changed from then to now. And I remember writing once that I thought probably I would pick it up again when I got a chance to after I retired. But I retired at 72, and my wife said, no, let's travel. And I didn't. And it's really hard to do a lot of traveling and be gone, 6 months of the year and try to maintain a falcon somewhere. So I just never did pick it up again like I wanted to, like I had envisioned and imagined that I would.
Well, I mean, you could have just gotten you one of those like Cadillac RVs or something and built you, had you a little part of that segregated off. You could have kept you a nice peregrine or something on a shelf perch and one of those nice big RVs, or something like that. And you could have just, you could have traveled all over and then you wouldn't have had a problem, finding a place to hawk and stuff too.
When I say travel, I mean, we went to Antarctica, we went to Greenland, we've been
international travel.
Patagonia. In fact, we've been to about 70 countries, and you don't go and spend you don't go and spend 6 months in Fiji, and then try to maintain. But we did maintain birds. When I moved back from New York to here, the university we had a biology building that had a flat top on it, but it had a kind of a, what would you say? The top was down deeper, and it had walls around the top that were probably 15 feet high, and so that was kind of an alcove in there. And they allowed me to build some chambers. We built 3 chambers that are about the size of this room that we're sitting in, and I don't know what the size of this room is, 20 by 20 or something like that. And I kept raptors for research in up there at the university, and probably I had all the kind of falcons you can probably get, and it was to do research with. So I kept very active in that. And the one thing that I remembered that was really quite interesting, Tom Cade had looked at kestrels, and he found that he did his PhD under a physiologist at the University of California in Los Angeles. And this guy was an ecological physiologist. And they looked at kestrels and they found that the tarsus, the length of the tarsus, was really important in temperature regulation. You could get heat out of it. And I said, well, you know what, that's interesting, because I had some lanner falcons in, and I said, look how long those tarsus are compared to a peregrine, and how long the prairie falcon tarsus is compared to the peregrine. Let's take a look and see if there's some heat loss in those, if they use them for temperature regulation. So I had a graduate student, a PhD student, and he built some chambers to be able to measure oxygen uptake and so forth. And we got a really nice study out of that just by measuring heat loss in the tarsus and relating that to the length of the tarsus. And then when you stop and look at things like a gerfalcon that has feathers quite far down on the leg and a kind of a big tarsus and a short tarsus compared to something like a lanner falcon that lives in South Africa, they have long, bare tarsus. So I kept active doing that kind of stuff that sort of was working with birds of prey.
It's cool that they were that accommodating, that, to let you, build those chambers and do that. And I'm sure it was easy for you to kind of, well, I guess I should say it was probably an easier sell for you in that, you're using those and doubling them as ability to do more research and things like that. That's pretty cool that you're able to at least work that out.
Well, when they gave me an offer, I had an offer down at UC Davis in California too, and I didn't get back to them soon enough, and so when this other offer came, I said, well, yeah, I'll do it, but I've got to be able to do the kind of research I want, and this is what I would like. Is that going to be possible? And they said, well, yeah, we can accommodate. So that's what they did, and that was good.
That's great, though, that you were able to, like I said, work that out. And before we get too much more ahead, though, because I do want to take this conversation more towards some of the research things and some of those other experiences that you've done. But you mentioned that you started into falconry according to you, the brief time that you were in it, around, you said 13 or 14, mm-hmm, right? Mm-hmm. So, what initially what sparked your interest for that? Like what got you into that initially?
Well, I really don't have a good answer to that. I think it was being introduced to a hawk. I had an interest in birds, but I also had an interest in political science, and I had an interest in working in foreign countries as a young guy. But I remember during World War II, my cousin in Wyoming, who himself worked for BLM and was a biologist, came home one day, and I was staying with him and his aunt, and my mother was there, and with us, and he came home with a dead red-tailed hawk, I remember. I don't know if he picked it up on the road, or I don't know the details, but he brought it home. And I looked at that hawk and kind of ran my fingers over its feathers and looked at it, at these big brown eyes that it had and these sharp talons. And I was kind of hooked on those kinds of birds rather than starlings and pigeons and, whatever else. And so when we moved back to Utah from Wyoming as a kid, we moved to Salt Lake City. I went to the Tracy Aviary, and there aren't many real true aviaries in United States. There's a lot of zoos, but an aviary is a place that has only got birds. And the only thing they had that wasn't a bird was they had munkjack deer, these little tiny deers that have canine teeth on the side of them. And the guy that was there, I asked him if I could come and hang out there and learn something about this stuff. So I would have been maybe 10 then, 8 or 10, probably 10. And he said, yeah, sure. And I don't know what I did, but I kind of became his little Lord Fauntleroy kid. And there was a guy there that worked there named Boyd Schaefer. And anybody who is in their later years of life will probably remember Boyd Schaefer. He was a falconer. And he asked me, he said, would you like to get what he called a sparrowhawk, which is a kestrel? And I said, yeah, that might be kind of fun. Well, he made a big deal out of this. He had a convertible, and we drove out to some place, and he said, now, I want you to lay down on the back floor. I don't want you to see where we are because I want to keep this secret. And it was a kestrel nest in a big cottonwood tree. It was a hollow up there. And that's where he got this kestrel from. And so I got that, and that kind of hooked me on birds of prey rather than waterfowl or game birds or something else. And then I got the hold of this article, Sport of Kings by Louis Agassiz Fortes. It was in the National Geographic, and read that and thought, boy, that might be kind of fun. And then Alexander Wentmore, about the same time in a 1930, National Geographic came out with Birds of Prey of North America, which he talked about all of these things. And he talked about watching peregrines on the Bear River marshes of Utah. And they were really quite common. They were probably overlooking the Bear River marshes where Bear River goes into Great Salt Lake. There's, I think now probably 2 game refuges there that are big marshes, and there were at least 3 or 4 peregrine eyries up there, which I'm sure he was watching the peregrines from them come out and hunt at the marsh. Well, I thought, well, gee, these things are right here close to me. They're only, Bear River Marshes is only 40 miles from here, 50 miles from where we're sitting right now. But from Salt Lake, they were only like 25, 30 miles away. And I thought, boy, maybe I could go out there and find some peregrines. Well, I didn't comprehend what was involved in finding eyries and getting into eyries and trapping a bird. And I didn't understand all of that because I had nobody to really work with except Boyd Schaefer, and I kind of relied on him to do what he did. He always had a peregrine and a goshawk in his yard and a prairie falcon in his yard. And I don't know why this was the case, because prairie falcons, I could take you to 30 or 40 eyries right, within a day. But then the guys that worked at the Tracy Aviary, there were 2 other guys there, a guy named Loren Carsey and a guy named Frank Welch. And they would get one prairie falcon, and they would kind of pass it around among them. One guy would fly it for a month, and then they'd give it to the other guy, and he'd fly it for a month, and we'd give it. So the impression you got is that these things were quite rare. And then I met Gerald Richards, who you probably know. He passed away just a few years ago. He started what's called sky trials, where you go out and put your falcon in the air and see how it goes. Well, Gerald started that here, and Gerald was a teenager. He was the same age as I am. He was a couple of years younger than me, actually. And he then said, well, I'm going to go find some prairie falcons. This is stupid to pass these things, get one bird and pass it around and let everybody fly it and let them have it for a month and whatever. But that's the way it was back in the 40s and 50s. That's the way they did things here in Salt Lake anyway. I don't know. Of course, they didn't do that elsewhere, but that was here. So that was the start that I had. And then when I got into university, the BLM started building reservoirs. The Colorado River only had one reservoir on it, and that was down at Lake Mead, down by Las Vegas. The Green River had no reservoirs. The Navajo River had no reservoirs. The Gunnison River had no reservoirs. And they started in the 50s. They decided to the Bureau of Land Management and the Bureau of Reclamation decided we ought to build some dams across these rivers. And that's because human populations took a big leap after World War II is over. And the University of Utah got a contract to what we call environmental studies. Today you would call it an impact statement. But what they were called environmental studies. And I was hired to work as a botanist. And the idea was we would go across a piece of land that was going to be covered by the reservoir. And we tried to get the whole length of the reservoir and look at the composition of the vegetation. And the botanist knew how much transpiration and evaporation those trees were. For example, you might say you had a cottonwood tree every 50 meters, and they knew how much water would be given off of the cottonwood tree during the course of a year. And if you put a reservoir in, then the state that tree was in got that water that would have been transpired out of that tree. So the idea was you'd know what the botany was, and then you knew how much water was being transpired up into the atmosphere, and that amount of water would then stay within your state if the reservoir went in. So that's what I was doing, and we came across probably 4 or 5 prairie falconries on the Green River, and that's where I took my first prairie falcon from. I had a pair of Ias tercels. They left the nest and flew out, and I went out and picked them up and kept them. And those were the first large falcons that I had with that pair, and it really taught me some interesting behavioral biology, because one of them was very different in its personality than the other one, and one of them was a really great flyer. In fact, this guy I told you about that flew a falcon off his fist to catch a coot, watched this little male fly, and he was a guy that flew casts of tercels a lot, and he said, "Well, yeah, I would really like that bird, and I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll trade you." And he had a lanner falcon, and I don't know what else. He had a goshawk, I guess. And I said, "Well, I think I'll just keep this bird." And he said, "Well, I really would like it." And the next day I went out to the same place he was, and he said, "Did you bring your bird for me?" And I said, "No, I think I'll keep it." And he got kind of uppity with me, and that kind of put me off. I thought, well, these guys that are really good at this, they aren't in a position to tell you what to do with your own bird. And that kind of hit me hard anyway. But that's the first bird I had, and I flew him for, 3 or 4 years, and had some wonderful, wonderful flights with that bird. And so that's where I got into this bigger falcon stuff.
Gotcha. Well, yeah, I mean, it's like I said, I'm always curious to find how people, whether it's reading books or articles, or having some other personal experience where they just kind of stumble into it. Something I always like to find, even it doesn't matter if someone's in it for a long time or short amount of time, which I still think, it's still a decent amount of years that you were able to practice before you had to make the decision to stop doing it, though.
Yeah, it was. I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed those years. Yeah. I did.
Yeah, what about it do you miss the most in hindsight?
I miss not being able to do something with raptors and doing research with them. It became quite difficult. The last one I had was a jerkin I took in Alaska, and I had to go back up to Alaska to do some work. And the bird was, I guess I had it for 3 years, something like that, and it died while I was up in Alaska. And so that having to be gone and not being able to take care of it yourself and rely on someone else to take care of it, I don't want to. I don't miss that at all. I think that was part of my decision that if I was going to be gone a lot, I wouldn't want someone to have to do that. And for example, I don't know if you remember that the Atomic Energy Commission was doing nuclear devices, atomic bomb testing in the Nevada test site. And they were above ground. And of course, that's where the downwinders are getting radiation. And I guess most people north of Nevada, of the test site, have been exposed to a certain amount of atomic radiation. Well, the United States, starting in about 1968, decided they would do no more testing like that. And the last tests they did were underground. And they had to find a place they could go within the United States to shoot off an atomic weapon where they wouldn't get a lot of flack from a lot of people. So they chose the Aleutian Islands. And the island of Amchitka was a big island that had four large, in fact, one of the Baker Runway was the largest airport runway in Alaska in the 60s and 70s. And I don't know how long that runway was, but it was big enough that you could take off B-17s and B-24s and that sort of stuff off of this runway during World War II. So they selected this island to do it. And I just happened to be working with a guy from Smithsonian Institution who was asked to write up a proposal and see if he could get a contract to do it. And so he and I wrote up a proposal together to do the bird work during the atomic testing, and it ran from 1968 to 1970. The last shot was 72. The largest atomic weapon that's ever been exploded, and it was a 6 megaton. And when you stop and think that the ones in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were kilotons, megatons is a mighty big device. And that was the very last atomic weapon that the United States ever shot. Well, we worked in the Aleutian Islands to find out if there were a leak, if there were a vent from the underground test. What would the radiation do to the fauna? Well, we were concerned that radiation would get into the lichens and into birds if you got it into ducks, and these ducks migrated down to Louisiana, which they do, or down the Pacific coast. And a duck hunter shot enough of them, and he put them in his backpack like they do. They have the pockets behind their kidneys. You could radiate somebody's kidneys. Now that's an extreme example, but they wanted to know is what was the bird composition like on the island, and which birds would be exposed to radiation more than other birds. And I had to go out there from New York. I was on a research fellowship at Cornell. So I had to fly out there probably 10 times a year and go. I was there for 2 months at a time, or 2 weeks at a time, and then I'd come back. And I was there all summer long from June through August. And so that would have put a real clinch in trying to keep a falcon as a falconry bird, but I could keep them as research birds in big chambers, because all you have to do is get someone to come and feed them, and that was easy to do. But being gone a lot, being back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, that's something that would have really not been conducive to being a good falconer.
Yeah, I can imagine. And yeah.
So anyway, that put a clinch in it, and that kind of sealed it.
So out of curiosity, what did you find out from the study? I mean, you've made it to 88 or 80, 87, 88.
I'm 88.
88, yeah.
Oh, well, I'll be 88 next month.
Right, yeah. So, I mean, going back and forth to those islands as much as you did, I mean, I guess you didn't pick up a whole lot of extra radiation yourself in the process.
No,
right?
there was absolutely no radiation leak at all. In fact, I watched the last shot they had had a code name of Canakin, and I was in a helicopter up when they had a tower there and that had a strobe on it, and when they pushed the button, the strobe went red, and I saw that strobe go red, and the ground at ground zero, probably over a 300-yard radius around it, rose up in the air about 18 feet and fell back down. No, that's not too high. It was about 12 feet. And then it settled back down to about 3 feet. So we had 3 feet of tundra fluffing there. And I had to go down and pick up any dead birds that were around in that area where the results were the most severe. So I would have been exposed. If there had been a leak, I would have been exposed to radiation without any doubt. And still today, I get a free physical examination every 2 years if I want it, to see if I do have any cancer or anything like that. They've set up the Atomic Energy Commission, which is now the Department of Energy, gives these medical examinations to all the people that worked out there, and so every 2 years I can get a free examination, and nothing's shown up, and there was no test, there was no any evidence of there being any radiation, and part of the reason I think I've been told this by workers that they did this is so they could monitor what Russia was doing, because they knew how deep the device was. They knew how many kilotons it was. How many megatons it was. And we had seismographs on many of the islands. I don't know if you know how the Aleutian Islands are, but they're sort of in clumps. There's about 4 major clumps of them. And the island that we were on is in what was called the Rat Island Group. There's 6 or 7 islands in that group. And then there's a big space of ocean, and then there's another clump of islands. Well, we had seismometers on all these islands. And so what the Atomic Energy Commission was trying to determine is if the Soviets set off a device, how big was it, and how far away was it from where the seismometers were. And that was part of this whole thing, to monitor what Russia was doing. Now remember, this was just after the Cold War was over with Cuba. So there was a lot of anticipation about what the Soviet Union would do and what it wouldn't do. But anyway, so that's where I became acquainted with the Aleutian peregrine. And we have a lot of guys today, a lot of falconers I hear say, well, I have a bird, it's a quarter Aleutian and it's a quarter this and a quarter that. I have some Aleutian blood in them. You look at them, and I'm going to show you a specimen of an Aleutian peregrine, what they really look like. So what I did, I asked if I could, we had on this island, varied from year to year, and I don't know exactly why. I don't know what the environmental reasons were, but it would vary from about 22 nests to about 18 nests. And I'm sure weather had a lot to do with it, because one year we had a really, 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 really bad spring, and Steve Sherrod, who was a falconer, whose name you may know, lives in Oklahoma, was one of my graduate students out there. And so we were checking nests, and we found one nest with 3 dead young in it. The adults couldn't find enough food to feed them. We found a nest that had 4 abandoned eggs in it. We found a nest with 1 abandoned egg, and then we found a dead fledgling on the tundra that couldn't be fed. So and there was only about 15 or 16 nests that year. So anyway, I asked the Atomic Energy Commission, I said, well, in the Fish and Wildlife Service, I said, if you stop and look at it, and let's say we have 20 eyries, and they have 3.5 young per eyrie, we're talking about 60 young a year being fledged. Would the population miss 4 birds? Well, the answer to that, of course, is no. So I said I'd like to have 2 pair, because I'd like to have them in Utah where it's really hot temperature, and because I want to do some physiology studies on them. So I got a permit for 4 Aleutian birds, and the next year was 1972, and the peregrine went on the endangered species list in 1971. And so in 72, Tom Cade had started the Peregrine Fund, and he was hot to get peregrines. And so he said, well, Clay, can you get me out there, and can you get me some Aleutian peregrines? So we tried that, and so Tom went out, and we brought back 4 more peregrines. So all these peregrines you hear people talk about that have Aleutian blood in them are all from the 8 peregrines which I brought back and Tom brought back from Amchitka Island. And I don't know if people have gone to some of the islands that are closer into the mainland of Alaska to get Peale's falcons. I don't know if they have done that, but they sure haven't gotten the Aleutian type. So anyway, that's the origin of all of those birds, and I don't know how successful they were. I think only one of my females laid eggs, I think. And I think in Tom's case, I think he only had 2 females that laid eggs. So I really don't know how successful or how much of the gene pool of released birds are from Aleutian peregrines.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really familiar with that subspecies very much at all. I'm don't really know a whole lot about, a lot of, some of these different, I mean,
they're the biggest peregrine there is, of course. They're the largest peregrine there is. And I'm going to show you a tercel here compared to a tercel from Australia, and you'll see that it's probably a third bigger. But anyway, they're the largest and heaviest of all the peregrines. And they're pretty unique. And I know that a lot of falconers, mine ended up in a breeder's chamber in Nevada, and I know that they have mixed them up with a lot of stuff. I don't think there's any pure Aleutian stock left unless some enterprising young guy in the 70s or 80s or 90s went out and got some birds and brought them back. But otherwise, they're all kind of mongrelized with all the other peregrines.
Well, and I guess we can go ahead and broach this topic, because this is one of those topics that I wanted to talk to you about.
Yeah.
And so since we're already kind of, more or less segueing into this naturally, I mean, there's always a lot of talk, or at least over the years, there's been a lot of talk, at least that I've heard anyway, just in my short time in falconry and stuff, is, just how much kind of mixing and matching of genetics, kind of came from, the whole trying to reintroduce peregrines due to the DDT, aspect of things, and whether or not it was all peregrines or just certain subspecies of peregrines and stuff that were ever really truly endangered and things like that. I mean, what are your insights as far as a lot of those things? I mean, there's a lot of speculation, at least from a lot of people, that, it was mainly just the anatoms, for the most part, that seemed to be mostly affected. And then other people are like, no, it was all peregrines. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I can't tell you about my thoughts, but I'll tell you about the data. Mm-hmm. The data are that starting in about early 60s, in Britain, they started seeing fewer peregrines than they thought there were. Well, there's quite an important history about this in Britain, because during World War II, when the Royal Air Force went out to shoot down German aircrafts coming across the English Channel, a lot of them took a homing pigeon with them, because they were assigned certain areas of the English Channel to patrol. If they got shot down and they had a banded homing pigeon with them, they could turn loose and it went back to the loft. They would know exactly, or they would know approximately where in the English Channel this guy was, because he had pigeon XYZ and he went to this part of the English Channel. And so peregrines were interfering with the wartime events in Britain, especially on the eastern coast of Britain. And so peregrines were being shot, and there was a lot of, and I don't know how much they reduced the total number. You hear all kinds of things, all the way from 50% to even more. But they killed an awful lot of peregrines because they would catch these homing pigeons, and they didn't want that to happen. They wanted to be able to get their pilots back. So Britain was really intensely surveyed, Scotland and England particularly, Ireland not so much, and Wales not so much, but especially England. So the Irish were really well known. They were known, and Derek Radcliffe noticed that there was this decline in them, and then he also started to see broken eggs in nests, and he wondered, well, why would they be breaking? And he thought this through, and as you know, an egg has these little micropores in it because the growing embryo has to exchange CO2 and oxygen back and forth through the eggshell. And if you want to see this, get a glass of water and go to the grocery store and buy a dozen eggs and come back and drop an egg in the water, and you'll see little tiny bubbles coming up out of the eggshell. Well, those are the little micropores in which there's exchange of oxygen with CO2 back and forth for the growing embryo. Well, as the shell begins to thin, those micropores get bigger and bigger and bigger. And they get so big that the egg will break because of the shell thinning. And that happens because, at least the British found out, it was because of the chemicals they were using, agricultural chemicals they were using, were interfering with calcium deposit. The female has to get her calcium from her bones, and if the calcium is not enough, the eggshell is not thick enough. So Derek Radcliffe came up with what's called the Radcliffe Index, and he measured, and to preface this, you should know that egg collecting was very, very popular. It's sort of like car collecting is, or stamp collecting, or coin collecting, or gun collecting, or wife collecting, or whatever else that you want to collect. Egg collecting was a big deal in Europe, and so there are literally thousands of clutches of eggs in collections in museums that go back to the early 1800s. So Derek Radcliffe went out and measured the length and measured the width of these eggs, and then weighed the eggshell, and he got what's called a Radcliffe Index. And when these shells got about 20% thin, that was a critical amount of thinning, and they would start to break. So the Brits knew this was happening, and they noticed a decline in their peregrines because eggs were breaking. And this was mainly a result of agricultural chemicals in highly developed countries. For example, Siberia was not a highly developed country, and you wouldn't expect to see many of the tundra peregrines from Siberia being affected by this. Australia isn't a agricultural developing country. While there's a lot of agriculture there, there's not like there was in Europe, for example. So Europe was really affected, and a guy named Joseph Hickey from Wisconsin went to a conference in 1964. They had a conference in England, and Radcliffe showing up there, he said, well, this is what's happening in England. What's happening in North America? Because North America is highly industrialized, and there's a lot of agricultural chemicals being used in North America. So Joe Hickey came back, and he hired a couple of guys to go around, and he knew of, and I'm not going to give you the exact numbers because I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was something like 360 nest sites he knew about in the Appalachian region. And so that's between Mississippi and the East Coast, and from Louisiana to the Canadian border. And there was something like 360 or 380 maybe known eyries. And these guys went out in 1964 and went to every single eyrie, and there was not a single eyrie occupied. And the people who in New York used to watch them there, the Palisade Cliffs outside of New York along the Hudson River, they disappeared, and someone said, well, we used to have peregrines here, but there are no peregrines now. What's wrong? So that was an alarm. And in 1965, Joe Hickey sponsored a conference in Wisconsin to find out if, in fact, peregrines were being affected if they were declining. And of course, they did here in Utah. In Utah, we used to have, along this Wasatch Front, we used to have about 20 pairs of peregrines. In earlier days, there was up to 30 probably. Today, in 2023, there's about 45 pair on there where they've come back. But anyway, because of this look, they started taking fat samples out of peregrines and looking at eggs that were breaking, and found out that in fact DDT was the breakdown product of DDT, which is DDE. It's a very stable compound, and it was interfering with the calcium metabolism and the calcium to put on eggs, and it interfered with steroid hormones. We say that the hormones are being hydroxylated. The hormones are such that they've got a space where they can take on an extra hydrogen. And when you take that extra hydrogen molecule on it, it changes the nature of the steroid hormone, and that's a sex hormone. And so you would go to a nest site and you'd see a female sitting there, and I saw this in Alaska in 1962. I sat at a nest site and watched a female sit above the cliff. It was on the 4th of July, and she had 3 young, and they were huddled there. There was a misty rain falling, and she sat up there with her head tucked back in her feathers, sat there, didn't care about her young. She didn't even, I don't think she even looked down at them. I had to go back and get warm, and go back to my tent and get warm for a while, and came back, and the young had died of hypothermia. The female never even did anything. Well, that's because her steroid hormones were affected. And at that point, we started doing surveys in various places, and there were known eyries. And since these eyries are so stable because of the phylopatry, the returning peregrines to the same eyrie site, it's pretty easy to monitor them. It makes a beautiful bird to monitor population numbers because it's so stable in its eyries. So we did notice that from the Arctic down to, at least into Mexico, the numbers had declined greatly. In fact, they were extinct in eastern United States and probably declined by 60%, 70% in western United States. And a lot of these in the United States, the reason they were declining is they're migratory and they're moving into South America where they're using all kinds of agricultural chemicals. Well, the places that were mainly affected, and for those people who think it affected every peregrine, that's not the case at all. They were affected in highly industrialized areas or in areas where birds from area A migrates down to area B, and in area B, they're using the chemicals and they're picking them up in area B. So that's why all of North America was affected, because our northern peregrines were migrating down to Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Argentina, Chile, and they were picking up chemicals down there. And so the northern hemisphere birds were, and nobody looked at southern hemisphere peregrines. Nobody looked at peregrines in Chile, for example, or in Argentina. They weren't monitoring them in India. They weren't monitoring them in South Africa, for example, where they're also using a lot of agricultural chemicals. So they were really only affected in the highly industrialized, what we would call Western cultures, like Western Europe and United States. But they did. In Australia, for example, one of the guys that worked in the Aleutian Islands with me went to Australia, moved there to work, and he got involved with peregrines work in the state of Victoria. And they contracted me to come over and start a study in Australia to find out how many peregrines there were in the state of Victoria. And the state of Victoria is about the size of probably the state of Utah and a bit of the state of Nevada. That's about how big it is. And there are probably 500 pair of peregrines there. And I went over in 70, 74, maybe 75. I can't remember the exact date the first time I went there. But I started a study to monitor them, took 2 graduate students with me, and surveyed the state of Victoria, and took some eggshells and eggs, and trapped some birds and took some adipose fat out of them. And they had some shell thinning up to about 10%, but it didn't get beyond that. And so there probably wasn't any egg breakage. The mean shell thinning in Australia was about 10%. And it only really occurred in areas where there was agricultural taking place, and that was primarily Eastern Australia. I don't think there's anybody that did any. There may be someone who had eggshell thinning from Western Australia, but if so, I'm not aware of it. There may well be. But that led to a study in Australia that I worked on for a long time. I guess 15 different breeding seasons I went back there. Well, I was able to get some Australian peregrines, and I brought back 2 pair of Australian peregrines. And to get back to your question, to find out how many what the peregrines were that were released and where they were from, when the Peregrine Fund started out and they had to get peregrines, they got some birds from the western United States from California. We took some from Arctic Alaska. The Canadians took some from the Canadian Arctic, and they bred them in Edmonton, Alberta, or right near Edmonton. I don't know if the breeding facilities were in Edmonton, or close to it anyway. So they got them out of the Arctic, and there were a few, what you would call anatom peregrines, in southern Canada when they got a couple of pair. And then the Peregrine Fund was able to get permits, and they got peregrines from Spain, from Scotland. They got one from South America, and I donated my Australian peregrines to them. And at that point, I was also working in Fiji, and I gave them 2 pair of Fijian peregrines. So the mixture of peregrines, and the guys, you got to remember, the people that were doing the hard work of fertilizing eggs, if you had a female that laid an egg, you don't care whether she was from South America, whether she was from Argentina, or whether she was from Canada, or where she was from, you inseminated that female with semen you could get from no matter where you get that semen. Well, that started this sort of mongrelization. And so a lot of peregrines that were released were not pure strain. They were a mixture of 2 or 3 different groups of peregrines from various continental areas. And there were at least 7 different areas from which peregrines were bred and from which semen was taken that were released. In North America, there are about 7,000 young birds that were released here. But to put that into a little better perspective, we did a study in probably 14 or 13, where we looked at what's called the haplotype. That's the clump of genes that move with the DNA. And we analyzed peregrines from 11 different areas. We had South Africa, Spain, South America, Australia, Fiji, Siberia, Arctic Alaska, Greenland, and I forget where else we had them from. But it turns out that we had 230 samples of blood from 11 different subspecies, and turned out to be about 20 different, what we call haplotypes. So there's about 20 different ways you can look at these. But haplotype number 2 had every single peregrine we had in it. So what that's saying is that peregrines in South America have the same some of them have the same haplotype as peregrines from Greenland have. Peregrines from Greenland have some of the same haplotypes as peregrines from South Africa. Peregrines from South Africa have one of the same haplotypes as peregrines from Australia. So while they look different, and while they look different morphologically, when you look at the haplotypes, there's let's see, let me remember what the value were. 52% of all of those peregrines from all over the world all had the same haplotype. In other words, that means that part of them were genetically identical to each other from every single peregrine we had. That at least some of them are identical in their genetic makeup to every other peregrine that we had. So while they do look different, and they are different genetically, they are also similar genetically. But you don't know how that's going to sort out. You don't know how those haplotypes are going to sort out when you're dealing with peregrines that you're turning loose. You don't know if you're turning loose something that's one of these really odd haplotypes that has a haplotype that's like no other peregrine that you've turned loose. And so you have no way to get a handle on how much variability, genetic variability, you're mixing when you start mixing birds from Spain with birds from Greenland, with birds from Alaska, and so forth. You have no way to measure that. So anyway, that kind of answers your question about where the decline took place and where it didn't take place and where peregrines were taken from to breed, to turn loose in the United States. And there were peregrines that are of what you call a pure an Adams stock, still in Arizona and southern Utah and southern California and Mexico. So we know that there's some pure stock there, but the things that were turned loose, let's say in Wisconsin and Kansas and Alberta and New York, they could be a mixture of birds from Spain, from England, and from North America, where you just take what semen you can get and you put it in whatever female you can put it in. And if the goal was to raise peregrines, you did what you had to do to raise them, and there was really no control over that issue. In fact, when I left my Aleutian peregrines, I left them with a falconer from New Mexico, and I said the only request I have is that you keep these birds pure. Would you do that? Well, he had to let the Peregrine Fund take him, and so they took him to Boise. No, they took him back to Cornell. The facility was at Cornell at that time, not in Boise. And so he sent him back there, and they, of course, didn't know what sort of arrangements I had made with the guy in New Mexico, who was really a good falconer, to keep them pure. And so when birds from the Aleutian Islands laid an egg, and if they had a male from England or from Germany or from wherever that was giving semen, they just stuck it in the bird and got a fertile egg. So they were quickly mongrelized and all mixed up. And I don't know that anybody really knows. Maybe Greg Septon in Wisconsin, who has kept kind of a genealogy of things, he probably knows more than most people about the genealogy of these and what the mixture was and how badly mixed they were. So that kind of gets back to your question about how many there were and what they were from and where they were released and where they didn't decline and where they did decline. And it really was only industrialized Western Europe that the decline was worse. And since they have been a recovery, people from South Africa, people from Argentina, people from Australia and Siberia, and we did from Fiji, we've all looked at eggshell thinning to see if, and this was done in the last 20 years, 15 years after the peregrine had recovered, where we did look back and to see, and in fact there wasn't anything that was, you would say, was severe eggshell thinning anywhere except in Western Europe and North America and Canada.
Well, I I appreciate you going that detailed with
That's
it.
a long answer to your short question.
Well, that's what I was looking for, though, because I've had people explain this to me in a much, much more generalized sense with a much, much shorter answer.
Mm-hmm.
And you never really feel like you get your answer that you want. You know what I mean? Or you never really feel like you get your question answered as in depth as what you hope for, in that kind of scenario. This scenario, however, this is by far and away the most in-depth explanation that I've ever gotten, and detailed explanation I've ever gotten. And I appreciate that, because now I actually feel like I understand this a lot more. You know what I mean? And it like I said, it's like, unless you really have, super detailed tabs on how everything was exactly done and really, and how these birds were exactly subsequently released and everything, you kind of had a first-hand dealings with it all. You can understand where it would be kind of hard for a layperson like myself and like a lot of people to really wrap their heads around how this all happened, and so I appreciate the more in-depth explanation on that.
Well, the unfortunate thing, in some ways, is there was enough, and I'm talking about North America. Well, I'm sure United Kingdom was the same way. There was still a lot of peregrines in Scotland that weren't affected. Peregrines in England are pretty much resident. I think there's only, they've banded maybe 3,000 or 4,000 peregrines in the United Kingdom, and there's only been 2 recoveries outside of the United Kingdom. So they're resident there. And so I'm sure that a lot of peregrines were still around in Scotland, and if you waited long enough, they would have come back. In North America, there were still a low number of peregrines in the Arctic. It got down to where you should have 50 pair, you get down to maybe 10, 5, 4 pair. And if you wait long enough, they would have come back on their own, because there was still a residue of unaffected peregrines. I won't say unaffected, but breeding peregrines in southern Utah. We know there was at least 2 or 3 iries there. Arizona had some. Southern California had some. Mexico had some. If we had waited long enough, the peregrines would have recovered. But that would have maybe taken 20 years. And in hindsight, and this is in hindsight, we know that would have happened. And I know Tom Cade and I talked about it, and he said, well, Clayton, I don't think we want to wait all that long. And I know before Tom died, we were talking about it, and he said, well, Clay, we could have waited, and they would have all come back, but we did what we could do. And like I say, they turned loose at least 7,000 young peregrines. And there was some controversy about that, because there was a book written in East Germany. You might remember after World War II, the Soviets took over Germany, and Germany was divided into a western side and an eastern side. And there was a guy in East Germany named Wolfgang Fischer that wrote a book. And he said, this will never work, because the young have to be trained how to hunt and how to catch prey. But that turns out not to be the case. And I was a little taken back, a little surprised to know how quickly these things can do on their own. We had a nesting tower out by Great Salt Lake in a place called Farmington Bay, and they put 5 young in it, one male and 4 females. And they opened the door to turn these things loose, and the male quickly bolted out and flew across the marsh and disappeared. And we all thought, well, that's the end of that bird. And the next year, he was the first bird back at that tower. So these birds were able to hunt on their own if they were kept where they could, and they were kept in big cages where they could look out and look at their environment, so they knew where they were. And when the cage was opened, some of them went out immediately. Some of them kind of hung around and took the quail that we brought into them and whatever, and slowly got going. But those towers were reoccupied. Utah had 7 towers, and they would come. The young would come back, and there were aerial battles between the original pair and some of their young about who got to breed on that tower that year. And one of the things that I was really surprised at is you have to remember that there's no innate. If a peregrine's raised on a pingo in the tundra, there's nothing to say that peregrine has to breed on a cliff. There's no genetic driven things that does it, but imprinting to where you're raised has a lot to do with it. So as we got peregrines breeding on these towers around Great Salt Lake, I can show you, in fact, I'll show you a picture after we're through with this thing, where there's a tower which is about 2.5 miles from an old eyrie, and the young would breed on raven nests on high distribution electric lines in raven nests, but didn't go back to the cliff and didn't go back for about 8 years. And they would fight over these raven nests on towers when they couldn't get a box. So there's a lot of behavior that we don't understand. And Wolfgang Fischer said, and he wrote a book. It's in German, but he said this will never succeed because it takes the parents to teach them how to hunt. And in fact, we do see some evidence of that when a female comes in with some young, and the young are flying, getting ready to go. And I had a student named Steve Sherrod who worked in the Aleutians with me. We'd sit at an eyrie and watch, and we'd see these young take off with that call going up toward a female bringing food, and she would just drop the food, and the young would fight over it and grab it, and then they would chase one another and so forth. So there is some, I don't want to say training, but there is some interaction as the young become independent of themselves with the adults to be fed, but they can make it on their own. They can do it. Some of them do, and some of them don't.
Yeah, well, and that's nature, and that's why 75% of them, that die within their first year. I mean, that's just natural part of it. But yeah, no, that's very interesting stuff. And like I said, I appreciate you being willing to give that long of an in-depth, answer to that very short and, well, obviously not necessarily simple question, but I appreciate you going to that depth. And now on that same line of thought a little bit, though, I have one of the things that I thought to ask you after we had our initial conversation about setting all this up was, I am curious though, and I know, like in my profession, for example, there's a lot of things that I wish, or, ideally would hope that eventually would change for the better in certain practices, or, you also regret kind of seeing certain things almost kind of sometimes digress a little bit, with how things, I don't want to use the word devolve, but, like along that line of thought, in all the years that you did all of this work and research, was there anything that you ideally would have liked to have seen, classified differently with any of these subspecies, or would you have rather seen some things like turn out differently with any of your research or data or any of these projects that you did? I mean, or did pretty much most of the things that you ended up doing research-wise and stuff turn out like you hoped it would?
I think most of it did. That's a good question, but I don't have a ready answer for you. But I think most things turned out the same, and what I think it comes back down to is no matter how hard humans try, there's always the there's always the problem of keeping, as human population increases, there's always the problem of keeping things like peregrines off the endangered list. Now, right now in 2024, starting in 2021, avian influenza hit birds in a bad way. This past year, they picked up about 1 million birds on the Peruvian coast, dead birds. And the avian influenza now is in the Galapagos Islands. It's in Antarctica. And in Alaska, for example, on the Yukon River, where we found in 1965, we had 18 pair there. Between the Yukon Territory and Circle, Alaska, that's about 150 miles of river. That's what Tom Cade found in the 50s. And so we thought, they're in no trouble. Well, they declined down to maybe 12, maybe 10 pair. I don't remember the exact number. And then they started to recover when the EPA banned pesticides. They started to recover. And the numbers of pairs that have ended up there in 2020 was 60 pair. 60 pair. And I was talking to the guy doing the study. I said, these things have overshot. These things can't maintain themselves at 60 pair. Well, within 1 year, in 2021, 10% were gone. In 2022, it was down to about 20% were gone, and now I think it's down about 37%. But that's because of avian influenza. So avian influenza, over which we have absolutely no control, could completely annihilate peregrine falcons. If they were to migrate down to South America and eat carrion, which peregrines do eat carrion, you might find that those peregrines that migrate would go completely extinct in Arctic Alaska. Whereas around Wisconsin, where they don't migrate, they've got to get, if avian influenza is not a big problem in Wisconsin, which it apparently is not, the guy that's doing work in Wisconsin has a stable number of pair, and they haven't declined at all, whereas in Alaska they've declined almost 40% along the Yukon River in just 3 years. So we have no control over that. We have absolutely no control over avian influenza. We have no control over what happens in other countries. We have no control over a lot of things that might drive them into extinction. So I think it's kind of foolish to say that since they have recovered, they're going to be safe. Well, they might in certain areas, and they might not elsewhere. And what causes the loss of them elsewhere is completely out of our control. So I don't know if that's an answer to your question or not, but all the work that I've done on them since the 1950s, I'm pretty pleased with it, and I'm pretty happy. And part of it is we do not understand the dynamics. For example, in Fiji, on the two major islands, Viti Levu and Vanuatu Levu, we came up with 18 pair, and then the next year we came back and there was something like 12 pair, and the next year there was something like 5 pair. Well, I think it turns out that in tropical environments, I don't think they breed every year. We could see pairs at nest sites, but they didn't lay any eggs. And so we don't understand the biology of them well enough to make any kind of predictions that you might not expect. For example, on the equator, in Ecuador and in Kenya, on the equator in Kenya, they can lay eggs anytime over an 8-month period, in Ecuador over a 7-month period. So you might go in October to a nest site and say, something's happened, they've disappeared here. Well, if you went back in July, they might have eggs. And the next year you went in July, you say, oh boy, now they've disappeared. and you go in December and they got eggs. So it's really hard to make a prediction. It's not certain when you make predictions about areas that you have enough background information to really justify your prediction or what you think it should be or what you think it shouldn't be. And I think with peregrines, it depends on how localized you want to make that prediction, how localized you want to make that problem appear, or that you want to resolve a problem, because there's a lot of difference geographically from point A to point B to point C. And I'm probably not even answering your question correctly now. I'm probably just babbling on.
No, that's fine. I mean, that's part of the question, as far as, just what your overall thoughts are with, some of the results that you've had over all these years that you've done research. But I mean, it's the other part of that question, though. I mean, in regards more towards, and if this part, might be one of those questions that you might be afraid to in retrospect, ruffle like some feathers, pun intended. I mean, was there anything as far as, how certain species, subspecies, or, classified or grouped or whatever, in all of your years doing all of this, I mean, that you would have seen maybe, I don't know, like done differently or like classified differently or anything out of all this different research or anything like that? Or
well, yeah, and there is, but part of this is a human problem, because you have people that we call splitters and you have people we call lumpers. Okay. For example, the gyrfalcon, the saker falcon, and the lanner falcon, and the lager falcon from India are all in the same group, which we call hierofalco. And they don't have this e-chip call with their courtship. Peregrine falcons, prairie falcons, and taita falcons have this e-chip call. And if I were a scientist and happened to be a lumper, I might say, well, based on their courtship call, I'm going to lump these three groups in the same classification. So I'm going to call a prairie falcon really a desert peregrine, and I'm going to call the taita falcon a pygmy peregrine. Or I could say, no, we're not going to matter about the call. We're going to look at DNA, and we're going to see how similar the DNA is. And we might say, oh boy, this haplotype of these peregrines is exactly the same as it is in a lanner falcon. So why are they so different? But we're going to use genetics as our determining factor, and so we're going to lump peregrines with saker falcons, or we're going to lump them with gyrfalcons because they have the same haplotype. So much of what we do in science is, unfortunately, I hate to say it, but it's in large part dependent upon the investigator, upon his or her preference or his or her criteria by which they make their judgment. So that gets at your question. Mm-hmm. And I'm one who, for example, I've used this genetic stuff, and I think Barbary falcons and red-naped shaheens are nothing but peregrines that happen to live in deserts and are therefore very red because they all have the same haplotypes, and they all do the same kind of things. They have the same courtship calls. They have a lot of things that would lump them together, and I kind of split those things that people call Barbary falcons. I kind of lumped them with peregrines, and someone else would split them away because of their size and their color. And so once again, that's a human judgment. That's not and you have no way to get around that human judgment. You have no way to convince someone, well, no, you've got to use foot color You've got to use the call. You've got to use what color the mutes are. You got to use whatever to lump them or split them apart, and that becomes a value judgment.
Gotcha.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it totally does, and that's why I wanted to ask you that, because I mean, I can only imagine with all of the different people whose, well, I mean, thought processes and overall personalities, brains are wired differently. Yeah, I mean, they're going to look at things in a different way. Even though everybody's looking at all the same data, the same genetics and stuff, like you said, some people might have a different viewpoint or a way of going about the way they want to look at that type of stuff. So that's why I wanted to ask you, because you've done so many years of this type of research, and that's why I wanted to get your thoughts on it.
Well, yeah. In fact, if you go back into the 1800s, there have been there's about 79 or 80 or maybe 85 different names, different subspecies named since then, and we've got them now down to about 20 different subspecies that really, really do show a difference. And the problem is, if you're dealing with evolution, and if you're dealing with the way people look, for example, I look at a guy from Nigeria, and I say, well, that guy's different than my friend up in Finland. Well, yeah, he is, but genetically they're the same. So am I looking at the genes, or am I looking at skin color, or am I looking at hair texture, or what's the basis of the criteria that I use? And right now there's a lot of, for example, the tundra peregrine, the one that I described, where it meets with taiga peregrines and autumn peregrines in Canada and Alaska. There's some gene flow back and forth, and so there's some people who say, well, the tundra peregrine is it's just a lighter color, an autumn peregrine. That's all it is. And there's others that say, no, it migrates differently. It has this is different, and that's different, and so there is this ongoing controversy, and it depends upon the criteria that you use to make your judgment.
Gotcha. Yeah, well, and along that line of thought too, I mean, the one other thing that I wanted to talk to you about before, we conclude all of this is, I did want to get some of your thoughts on, in all the years that you did research, how hard. I mean, first of all, for those of us that really aren't that familiar with the process and how you go about getting grants and submitting all this data, like basically compiling this whole process of getting, research projects, grants, and everything, forming all that stuff together. I mean, kind of go over what the process was like, for you, and, just all of the different, I mean, I can only imagine how, what the total list is for how many of these research projects that you did. But I mean, what was the process like overall, in getting all of these steps compiled and all these different projects put together? I mean, and how, did that process change from whenever you initially got into research to whenever you retired? I know that's a huge huge span of time, but I'm curious about how all that kind of evolved for you.
Well, it's changing now. It's being much more competitive now. I was sort of lucky because I was kind of caught at the crest of the wave, the pesticide thing, because I made connections. And I don't know how I made a connection with leading people who were doing leading research, but I made a connection, and I did, and they hired me to do certain work. And once you'd done that work, and once you'd published that work, then other people see that, and then they contact you and say, "Would you come and do this?" And that's what happened in Australia. I worked in the Aleutian Islands with the Atomic Energy Commission, and one of my colleagues went to Australia, and they said, well, we got to look at peregrines here. We can't worry about what the British say or the Americans say. Let's see what the Australians are saying. Do you know of anybody that can do this? And he says, yeah, this guy can do it. So then they contact you. Okay, that's one way it happens. The other way it happens is that you come up with a unique idea, and you gather some data. You might go to, let's say you're with a university, and you go and you say, I need some seed money to do some initial research and get a little bit of data. And you get that little bit of data, and you say, oh, well, I obviously can expand this, and here's how I can expand it. And then you get more data, and then you write up a grant proposal, and let's say you send it to the National Science Foundation, and the National Science Foundation puts it in a certain program, and they have people there who review them, or they send them out to people to review. And the reviews that come back, if the reviews aren't good, then they write you and say, well, we're sorry we can't fund you this year because we don't have the money, or we don't think your research is up to snuff, or whatever. And for example, today I get all kinds of requests to review papers who people send them in to get them published. And I write back and say, well, as far as I'm concerned, this is a great paper. This guy's done this guy's done that. Or I write back and say, well, it's got some flaws, and here's what needs to be changed. Or I write back and I say, well, it probably is not worth publishing. It's not cutting edge, let's say. And so it can be a very, very complex thing. And until you, and I can only look at it from the academic point of view, we wouldn't hire somebody into an academic position, even though what he's being hired for is to teach. What he or she has to do is do research and bring money into the university, and the university takes an overhead. If I get $1 million grant, the university may take $500,000 or $100,000 overhead out of my grant. So really all I get is $900,000. And if I can do that on a regular basis, the university thinks, well, it doesn't matter how bad his teaching is. Look what he brings into the university. Or if I go and I'm a first-rate teacher, and I can only talk about this from the academic thing, I can't talk about it from any other way. They say, well, yeah, he's a heck of a good teacher. The students really like him. He gives them all good data, but he doesn't help the university much. He doesn't pay his way, in other words. And academia is very expensive right now. So the competition to get money is very, very hard. But there's an escape valve here. If you've done something and you've done it well, and you've published it in a journal that a lot of people can see, someone in a foreign country, and this happened in Fiji. They saw in Fiji, they looked and said, oh, this guy did this, and this guy, and this guy, he's in the United States, but this is what he did, and he can help us here. Let's contact him. And so that's kind of why we went to Fiji. So it can come down several different ways, but most of it is it's becoming extensively competitive, and with techniques changing all the time. If I were interested, let's say, in the behavior of young peregrines, and I were competing with someone who was looking at the human genome and what genes cause autism, who do you think would get the money? The guy who is looking at autism in humans, not the guy that wants to see how baby peregrines learn to hunt. So that's one of the things that's happening now as we are changing, as the internet is coming in, And now they're starting to talk about artificial intelligence. And that's going to change an awful lot of the way we're able to get money, we're able to do research, we're able to do this or do that or do something else. So right now we're in a very changing world.
Yeah, no, that's very, very true. And you bring up a good point about the whole AI conversation. We won't even get into that because I know
absolutely nothing about that. I really don't.
I mean, it would be purely speculative on both of our parts to talk about all of, how, because I mean, who knows how it's going to change because it's changing right now and, ever evolving. But,
well, I was only ever turned down on one grant proposal. And then I took the same data, and I thought, well, what I've done, I've tried to go to too much of a prestigious money source. I'll go to a lesser money source. So I submitted it again to a different agency, and they didn't like it either. So I submitted it then to a different agency, and they said, hey, this is exactly what we want to do. Let's fund this guy. And we're only talking a couple of $100,000. So you can play the game various ways, and you can sort of manipulate things depending on whether you're on cutting edge research or whether you're not. So there's not a single answer to your question. Mm-hmm. Is what the problem is. There's no single way that things take place.
Well, and I hope I didn't word the question too convoluted either, but...
no, you didn't. You didn't, but it's just a hard question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and as far as your personal situation goes, I mean, what do you think it was about how you went about your methodology that contributed to the fact that you were able to have so much success and get all of this different research accomplished? I mean, what do you think was the main deciding factor in how you went about doing things?
Oh, I'm just such a cheerful, happy guy.
Just charming and super approachable.
I'm just a charming guy, yeah. And that guy likes me. I don't know. I don't know. I think I was in the right place at the right time and knew the right people. And they knew how to go about this, and so they were successful, and they hired me to do the work. And after I did the work, then the agencies or funding sources say, well, this guy did this, even though this other guy was the chief in the whole thing. This guy did that, so we can fund him. And once you establish yourself as somebody who looks like he knows what he's doing or she knows what she's doing, once you establish yourself at that, then it becomes much, much easier. I was on the National Science Foundation division of Arctic polar programs, where we had to look at reviews. We had to look at applications for money both in the Arctic and in the Antarctic. And I served for 5 years on this committee. And I saw something there that kind of bothered me. Probably the second to last year I went, a colleague of mine who had been at University of Utah was at University of Seattle, and he was on the committee. And we had funded a woman at about $1 million a year to work on krill. The krill's this little teeny invertebrate that's in cold waters. That's what the whales feed on when they go down there. That's what the penguins feed on. It's an important thing. And this woman was a krill specialist, and they had funded her at a very high rate over about a 5-year period. And so she put her proposal back in. And this guy I know, who was at University of Washington, said, you know what? There was a guy that just did a thesis out of Princeton University, and on krill, and she didn't quote him, so she's not up on the literature. I think we ought to cut her funding by about half. Well, that flabbergasted me to hear that happen, but it's because money was so tight that what they wanted, they figured that this woman had gotten sort of lackadaisical because she should have known. I didn't know that the dissertation had come out. In fact, you would have to have gone to, there's a publication called Dissertation Abstracts that comes out maybe once a year or whatever, and you'd have to go to that to know that this guy had done a PhD. You have no way of knowing it. And so it's logical that she missed it. But this guy said, well, she did miss it. And since she did miss it, let's, quote, teach her a lesson and we'll cut her by half on her funding. Now, I left that committee before I know how that turned out, and I don't know whatever took place. But that did happen, and it's a case of kind of knowing who you know, and that you do, and the results you get are something that someone who funds would want to hear you get, and who thinks, well, he's done a good job, because that's kind of the way I think. Let's fund him. There's a lot of human judgment that goes into all of this stuff, and it's really, really, really competitive now. And does that answer your question?
Yeah. No, it answers my question. Like I said, was just curious if there was any other. I mean, what you said was kind of what I suspected, because it doesn't matter what industry, what field, or whatever you're in. It really is just, yeah. I mean, how can you make yourself appealing, or what you're doing appealing to the right person at the right time in order to accomplish what you want to accomplish?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. I mean, you basically describe the music business and every other kind of art form, industry, or whatever,
Yeah.
Who's the person that's going to come along just at the right time, that's going to admire your painting or whatever, and want to, invest in you, or, whatever kind of music you write. I mean, it doesn't matter,
Well, one of the things that you can do in academia, and I guess you could probably do it in your profession also, is you can kind of do a literature search and see the direction that things are going in the arena that you're comfortable with, and in the field that you're in, and you can kind of see where things are going and say, well, it's going to go in this direction. I had better retool and get up to date on this. And this is happening, let's say, with peregrines, because people are now starting to use DNA and all of the tests you're doing. And I don't know how. I publish with a lot of people who are doing the DNA work, and a lot of it I don't understand, and I don't have the interest to try to retool myself to understand exactly what this means or exactly what that test is. But that's the way things are going, and I'm at the age where I don't really care where it goes anymore, to be honest with you. But I know a younger guy should do that, should kind of survey the field and see where the emphasis is going and where the money's been put, and then if he's interested in that, kind of retool himself and update himself on that and become competitive. And then he's okay.
That makes sense. And, the next thing I wanted to talk to you about too, and this is the last thing that I kind of want to make sure that I cover with you before, we get a couple of good stories from you and start kind of wrapping this up a little bit. But I mean, was it just kind of a natural decision for you to want to, become a writer also, or write a couple of books, because you were already doing all this research and already had all this data and had all this information already kind of compiled? Was it kind of a natural next step for you to want to go ahead and write a couple of books too? Or how did that process come about for you?
Yeah, yes and no. It became clear to me in my job, my salary was dependent on how active I was in research, how much money I brought in, how well I did on student evaluations and how active I was in communities, in community activities. And so it became clear that I had to write stuff down and do it to get increases in salary. And it's a funny thing. Once you write something and it gets published, it's kind of heady. You kind of say, "Hey, that's pretty neat. I think I'll do another one." And so this kind of cascades once you start doing it. And this, you said, write a couple of books. Well, one of them, the first one that is called Peregrine Quest, I was with my friend from Bill Emerson, who was in the Aleutian Islands with me, went to Australia and to get a job. And he was the one that invited me over to Australia to bring students and get a research project going, and which is still going now after 30 years. They've hired a full-time guy to do peregrine work now in the state of Victoria. And we were sitting one night, this would have been, probably in the 80s, and I had gone over to work with red-tailed black cockatoos, which was a bird that he was working with. And we were sitting at a sheep camp, and all the big, out in the outback, all the sheep camps and cattle ranches usually have an Aboriginal name, which they give them so that you can identify. So you don't have to say, "Well, yeah, I'm going to Joe's place, and his place is 12 miles off of Highway 9 and 5 miles past Highway 12, and that's where it is," But you can give them a name, an Aboriginal name, and they know exactly where to go. Well, we were at this sheep camp, and we were sort of reminiscing about experiences we'd had and things that had impressed us, and sort of starting with our teenage years, actually, what things were important to us, what things made us kind of stop and think about things, what things were serious and what things weren't serious. And Bill said, what you ought to do, Clay, is you ought to write all of these down. There's 8 or 10 things you could write about. Why don't you write a popular book and just write about what you've done, and some people will like it and some won't care one way or the other. And so I started jotting a few things down, and the more I jotted down, the more I thought, well, this is kind of fun. This calls back to memory some things that were very important for me, or some things that I was very serious about. And so I just kept writing, and writing is no problem for me. It comes quite easy for me. I'm quite lucky that way, I think, because a lot of people just can't bring themselves to doing it. And then someone said, "Well, you ought to write this. You ought to do this. You know enough about this to make some sense and to give some information that someone might like." And so it kind of developed that way. It developed very, very slowly with conversations with people and their suggestions, what maybe I might enjoy doing or might not enjoy doing. And once you've done it, then it's easier to do it again. And that's what you'll find. You'll find guys. We had a guy on our faculty who taught anatomy, and he was convinced he ought to write an anatomy text, and he teamed up with a physiologist and wrote an anatomy and physiology text, and he was very successful. And that stimulated him to write another one. And this guy probably did 5 or 6 of them. Well, it was financial for him to do that. But what it was after doing the first one and finding some success, that stimulated him to do another one. And that gave him more success because it was a new way of looking at things and new data and a different amount of royalty money was coming in, and so let's do another one. And that brought in more royalty money. So in the case of people who write textbooks and so forth, it turns out to be a large part. No, I won't say a large part because I don't know that for sure. It turns out to be in some part financially advantageous to do it. In the case of what I've done, there's no finances, there's no financial credit involved. In fact, the book on Peregrines of the World, the company emailed me and said they want to do it in French, and here's a French company that wants to do it. And I thought, well, I ought to ask my co-authors, and I won't use their names, because one of them said, no, if they can't read English, let's not worry about them. Well, that kind of put me off. And so when I got back with the company, I said, well, yeah, let's do it. And they said, well, no, it's reached its peak in sales, and they have to hire a professional translator, and that's costs a lot of money, and you have missed the peak in sales, and so they're not interested. And unfortunately, I should have said yes just right then, but I thought, well, I owe it to my co-authors to find out what they want to do, and I didn't expect to get the answer that I got from one of them. But anyway, that's a different story. That goes into a whole different direction.
Well, we don't have to go in that direction.
No, we don't have to go in that direction.
Well, out of the books and things that you have written, I am curious, though, which one did you find the most rewarding personally to take on or produce?
I think the one was a scientific paper that I was in. I happened to be the senior author, but I didn't do a lot of the work. Had to do with the genetics of peregrine falcons, various populations, because I believe very firmly. I'm an evolutionist, and I believe very firmly in natural selection, and I believe very firmly that the environment has a big part of the physical and even physiological things that we possess, and that natural selection is what causes the diversity of life on the planet. So I'm a hardcore when it comes to that. And so as I see the field move from looking at the differences from a morphological point of view to the differences from genetics, and it's going to move even more to the genetics molecular biology side, it's going to move more that way. So when I did this one paper on the genetics of peregrines, of all the peregrines we could find, to look at the relationship between them, I think that was, in my mind, that was one of the more rewarding things that I was ever involved in, simply because of the techniques that a lot of there were probably 3 or 4 co-authors on that paper, the techniques that they used and they knew, and it gave me some enlightenment and gave me a little bit different perspective on A, B, C, and D than I had. So I think that, and that was a big one.
Well, and conversely, I also have to ask, which was one of your more challenging or like what either writing project, research project, whatever the case was, that pissed you off so much at times that you wanted to just throw in the towel? What was one of the more frustrating projects you ever were involved in? And you don't have to go into specifics about certain things. I'm just curious.
Yes. Okay, I won't. But I started a master's thesis. Tom Cade wrote his dissertation on peregrines and falcons in Alaska, and I got to know Tom because I went to a international meeting and met him there, and we had a good time, and we talked, and we kind of bonded. And so that's part of why I went to University of Alaska. And when I got there, my major professor said, well, I really don't have money for you, but I have money if you want to study physiology in redpolls. Well, redpolls are little finches. They're about, 5 inches long, 4 inches long. They're little finches that weigh 12 grams in the summer and 15 grams in the winter. And they say the whole winter up in Alaska, and you'd think they would freeze to death. And so she said, I'd like to know what it is that they do that allows them to stay over winter in Alaska. They're such tiny birds. Why don't they migrate out? Well, I would try this, and she would say no. And I got really, really frustrated. I just about dropped the whole project. But then when I said, well, okay, I'm going to look at, I noticed that when you put them in a cage overnight, and they weigh 15 grams when you put them in the morning they weigh 13 grams. If I didn't feed them, they would be down to 10 grams, so they have really high metabolic rates. And that dawned on me that there was something going on with metabolism, and that's tied into adipose fat, the amount of fat that you put on. And in the winter, if you don't do any work, you put on some fat. And in the summer, when you work stress, you take that fat off. Well, that's subcutaneous fat. And there's a way to extract that subcutaneous fat. So I went out and collected a bunch of redpolls in the winter and looked at the fat. And then I noticed what they were eating. And I said, well, they're eating birch seeds. And she said, well, so what? What does that matter? I said, well, hadn't we ought to find out what the caloric value is in birch seed? And she was down on that, and that discouraged me. That was really discouraging. I said, well, to hell with this. I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to go right ahead and find out what kind of caloric value there is in birch seed. It turns out that birch seed has the highest caloric value of any seed there is. It's higher than wheat. It's higher than oats. It's higher than... And so what they're doing, they're feeding on a really high energy food, and they're storing that food. They're storing their food in little pouches on the side of their neck, and all night long, they're taking those seeds out and metabolizing those, and they're shivering. They're using what's called shivering thermogenesis. They generate heat by shivering, and they're able to shiver all night long because they're feeding on high caloric value food. Well, she wasn't happy with this. She thought that I ought to do something else, and she really discouraged me. But that was one of the really, after I got over my discouragement, I dawned on me that I was dealing with a personality that was completely opposite of my personalities, and it had nothing to do with science. It had to do with what she thought was important versus what I thought was important. And so I got over that discouragement pretty fast when I started getting good results. And I must say, I was discouraged enough that I didn't want to publish that material. And a colleague up there who worked in the Arctic biology laboratory said, no, I think we ought to do it. And I ordered a bunch of reprints from it. And I must say that of all the papers that I have written, every one of the reprints on that thing went, and mainly they went to people in Siberia, in Finland, in Scandinavia, in Canada, and in areas where this finch happens to occur, in which the same questions may have been asked by people who wrote me and asked me. But I went through, I think I ordered 100, and I went through 100 in about 4 months, and I don't think I got one from North America, one request from North America. I think they were all high Arctic researchers in different countries. So it turned out okay. And it turned out that my disappointment was probably because I have a different personality than my major professor had. She was kind of a hardcore. I don't want to say anything too negative about her, but it was a personality clash more than it was anything else. And I decided to, once I started getting some results that I could understand, I decided I was going to go ahead with it. So I didn't get to work on what I wanted to, but what I wanted to work on was enormously gratifying.
Well, that's good. Glad that you're able to find some silver lining, out of all that. But,
well, and I didn't even go to her funeral when she died. But I must say, and I didn't realize this, when she died, and you don't think of university professors doing this, but when she died, she gave half her money to the university and half of it to an organization, and she left $18 million. And where she got that from, I don't have any idea.
No, me either. Not as a professor.
Not as a professor. And so that tells me that on the side, she was doing an awful lot of nickel and diming, of doing a lot of a nickel investment or whatever, and had a good investor and was really a cheapskate when it came to certain things, and was investing that money. She was using her brain to invest that money. But to get $18 million, and she left half of that with the university and half of it with an organization.
Yikes! Well,
so that explains a little bit her dour personality, I think.
Well, yeah, we have to deal with all types.
Yeah.
But before I guess we start to wrap this up, I do want to still get one of your more. I mean, you've already shared a lot of great experiences and different aspects, stories, things like that. But whether it's from your days as a falconer, hunting, particular flights, particular bird that you flew, it could even be some of the more memorable aspects of some of the research you've done. I do want to get one or two good stories and more memorable stories that some of your favorite experiences that come to your mind, and then we can come close to wrapping this up. I think.
In fact, I don't want this to be the last one, but something that comes to my mind, which I have never forgotten, and which I thought was absolutely a stroke of genius. When I was doing autopsies, there was a woman that had committed suicide. She would have been about 30, 35 maybe, and she had dyed red hair. And in those days, there was a commercial, and I think it was by, what's the hair dye company? Chlorel. Is it Chlorel hair dye? I forget what the hair dye company is, but there was commercials on television of seeing a woman with long, beautiful hair, and she was throwing her hair back and forth, and they would say, well, if you use dye XYZ, you'll have hair like this, and only her hairdresser will know that her hair is dyed because it's so natural, it looks so good. Well, we had the sophomore, in medical school, as a sophomore, you take pathology. And at University of Utah Medical School, there was 82 students in the sophomore class, and they come for their first autopsy. You have to have a good cadaver for them to do it, and the pathologist, the guy with the MD degree, said, well, my colleague, Mr. White, will circulate among you with smelling salts, because when I make my first incision, and you make an incision from one shoulder to the sternum in the middle, and an incision from the other shoulder down to to meet up with the incision down on the sternum, and then you cut straight down to the pelvis. And when you do that, as the body tissue pulls back, you have this white fat under there, and blood kind of oozes out, and it's kind of, unless you're familiar with it, it's kind of a sickening thing to watch this blood oozing out of this human. And he said, our experience is that 1 or 2 or 3 of you will pass out, and if you do, what you should do is change your major, and you should go into hoof and mouth disease rather than what we're in. And so this woman with this really bright red hair, he threw the sheet back to make that first incision. and he didn't miss a beat. She had black pubic hairs, and what he said, just like the Chlorel commercial, he said, well, only her hairdresser, her husband, 2 pathologists, and 84 medical students know for sure. And there were still 2 guys that passed out, and that I had to go around with smelling salts and break smelling salts and give to these guys. But for me, that was a very memorable experience because I saw how casual Dr. Cancilla was with all of this stuff. And I know it makes a lot of people, they think that's kind of gross and grody and, distasteful. But you can make it. You can make it what you want to make it. And I thought Cancilla, Dr. Cancilla, was really, really clever to move as quickly. He didn't even miss a heartbeat to move so quickly into something like that, and then to make it so enlarging. I was really impressed by him, and I stayed in touch with Cancilla for probably 20 years after I got my own profession, because he was a kind of a guy that you'd want to be around. Let's see, your question was another...
Yeah, I mean, as far as another memorable story, too, as it pertains more towards, hunting experience or a bird that you flew or, a particular, aspect of a research project you did, something. But, I mean, I am curious, though. I mean, you've lightly touched on some of your falconry. You said you've had some really nice flights, whenever you were practicing falconry. I mean, what was one of the more memorable flights that you had?
Well, I had this little prairie falcon tercel. I called him Little Bill. He would go out of sight. He would go up out of sight. And here in Utah, the California gull is a really conspicuous bird. And in the evening, around let's say in April, May, they will get in flocks and go up and find a thermal and go up almost out of sight. And Little Bill, I put him up, and I was trying to get, like I say, we were in an area where the only thing you could really get would be meadowlarks or mourning doves or something like that. Starlings hadn't even invaded into Utah yet. Starlings got here in about, maybe they had. They got here in about 1955, something like that. And with the prairie falcon tercel, there weren't any ponds out there, and he couldn't take a pheasant, and there weren't that many pheasants anyway, and we couldn't go that far from the city because we had to ride our bikes. So I put Little Bill up, and by golly, he caught this thermal, and he went up out of sight. I mean, I was watching him with binoculars, and he went completely out of sight in a thermal with some gulls. So I got my lure out and started luring and hollering and so forth, and nothing. And it was probably a half an hour or more. And I was with my friend Gary Lloyd, and I'm going to show you a picture of him after we're through here. I got a picture there with one of those books. You ought to see this kid. He was really a nice kid. And he had a female prairie falcon, which didn't match up to what my tercel could do. But we were there for about a half an hour, and he said, well, I'm going to go home because, he said, you've lost your bird. And I kept swinging my lure, and this may be a little bit of imagination, but I could swear I could hear him coming from the sky. I could hear this, and by golly, he came out of from a place out of sight, so he had to be up above where gulls go, and stooped down at this lure that I was luring with. And the noise that he made as he went past my ear, he didn't hit the lure. I pulled the lure away, and he went past my ear and turned and went back up, and he went up probably 400 feet. He had that much speed that he went up and turned over and came back again, just about as fast. And I put the lure away, and he made another stoop, not even at the lure, but just at me. And I interpreted that as the fact that he was saying, here I am. Where's the food? And I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed watching a falcon fly as it should fly. And I wish that we would have been in an area where there was a lot of game. I wish that I could have done that. But it didn't turn out that way for me. It has for a lot of other people. But with the limited expenses I had and the limited way I had to travel, and then the jobs that I had that took me away from it, and then I got married because both my parents had died, and I thought, well, I don't want to be alone. And so when I met my wife and got married, that took me away. And so some of the most memorable experiences is in flying that prairie falcon turtle because of the way he flew and how high he would go. I couldn't see him with my binoculars. And I had 7-power binoculars. I could not see him. And yet he was above me, and he stayed with me, and he followed me. And when he decided to come down, he did. And when he decided to land on the lure, he did. And the next day, if he decided to do the same thing, he did. But he always came back. He always came back to me. And he always, if I threw the lure on the ground, he was always there. And one night, it got dark before he did come back. And I went out the next morning, and there was these roadside signs they put up, go to Las Vegas and, get money or whatever. And there was one right near where we would fly. And I went back out, and there he was sitting on the sign. I stopped my car, and he flew right over and landed on my car. Here I am. Where's my food? And it was an association that I had with a single bird, that it wasn't the kind of ego kind of thing you get with a bird where you say, well, I killed 2,400 head of game this year. There wasn't any ego involved in this with him. It was a friendship, and it was a thing that, and I had never experienced that before, and I have never experienced it since. With the gerfalcons that I flew, and I didn't experience it. I thought I might with one I took near the mouth of the Yukon River out on the Yukon Flats. I don't know that you know much about the Yukon Flats, but the delta is huge. It covers probably, if you were to drive from Farmington, Utah, down to Lake Point, Utah, it probably covers that much area, the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta in Alaska. And there are volcanoes out there. There's 4 volcanoes, and 3 of them have gerfalcons nesting in the cone, in the lava in the cone. The only way you can get to them is with a helicopter, really. Anyway, but I had a chance to get a gerfalcon, but I had to get it out of there. And I was with a helicopter, and so I had my pilot land me, and I took it in. He was really young, and so the whole thing was, he was imprinted, and he didn't really want to leave me. He was imprinted bird, and I had a lot of trouble getting him to fly it. I couldn't get him quite done at the weight that I should have gotten him, but I had a lot of fun with him just the same. But I didn't take any game with him. But those are memorable things that I did that stimulated me, and that had made me think that when I got retired and had time to do things, that I would pick the sport up again, and I would get me. I would probably use a Fijian peregrine because I really like them, and I had access to peregrines from Fiji and peregrines from Australia and peregrines from quite a few places. So I thought, well, I'll just use a Fijian peregrine, and I'll get active again. Well, it turned out that after I retired, my wife says, okay, we've got a chance to go to Patagonia. Let's go down for a month. And so then we would go to Patagonia and get home, and she'd say, well, my friend so-and-so that lives in Finland has asked us to come up and go to Finland, and then we can go over to St. Petersburg, and so we did that. Well, I never got back into it again. I never did. The heart was there, but the energy wasn't there. The blood, the falconer's blood was still in me, but circumstances. I had to make a choice. I could have made a choice to do A, B, C, or D. And in talking with my wife, I decided to do C rather than B. And so I remember the really good times I had with the prairie falcon, with the gerfalcon. I remember the really good times, but they weren't like the falconers today. They weren't like the falconers where you go out and you have telemetry on them, and you have things that tell them how high they fly and how fast they fly and what their body temperature is and so forth. But there was none of that. And I made my own hoods, and they were sloppy hoods, but they worked. That was all that mattered to me. And so those are some of the really memorable times that I had to do that. And then when I moved back here, one of the trustees at the university had a son who was interested in falconry, and he came down to visit me and said, "Would you help my son?" And I helped him and got him into contact with people, and he's now flying gerfalcons. And I don't know how successful he is. I don't know what he does. I've kind of lost contact with him because he's still teaching, and he's probably 30 years younger than me, and he's got different interests than I do now. But that was also rewarding to have someone like that come to me and say, "Well, I've got my son who really wants to do falconry, and he has read a lot of the stuff you've done, and he wants to do it. Would you take him under your wing and sort of shepherd him through this whole thing?" And that was rewarding, and that had to do with falconry.
Cool. Yeah. No. I mean, that's like I said. It's all about trying to help out where you can and giving back. And it sounds like you've, like I said, I mean, with all your research and experiences, and I mean, it sounds like you've given back plenty, and you've contributed a lot of knowledge, when it comes to all these, all this, like these peregrines and all these different birds. And, like I said, I mean, I commend you on a lot of really valuable research and a really long career. I mean, it sounds like it was a heck of a ride,
It has been a good ride, and I don't really have many regrets.
Well, that's good. That's good. I mean, that's all we can ever really hope for, I guess, at the, when it's all said and done. Just hope you have a lot more positive memories and experiences, and have way more things that you value and hold dear than regret. I mean, that's all we can really hope for, I guess, in life.
Well, I kind of envy the falconers who are really successful at the sport. And I don't know how much time they put into it. Due to my circumstances, I wasn't able to put a lot of time into it because of the circumstances that I lived in under. But I am really sort of envious of some of those guys that have really done a lot of things. And I was invited to go over to Saudi Arabia to a conference where falconers were, and I met a lot of people in the Emirates that I've kept in contact with that like falcons. And I found it interesting. You probably know Dave Jameson. Dave called me a while ago and said that they don't hunt hubaras anymore because they've hunted them all out in Saudi Arabia. So, and in fact, when I went over, they were going to Libya to hunt hubaras. And I couldn't spend the time to go with them, but he said now they're racing birds instead of flying them on game. They're racing them, and he wanted to know if I had any idea about. Because one of the guys that came over said, "Well, a black gerfalcon flies faster than a white gerfalcon or something. Who knows what it was?" And so Dave called me to hear about it, and it was exciting for me to hear that they're doing a sport that they enjoy, and it's quite different than the falconry thing, but it's with falcons. It's racing them and so forth. And I don't know how they do that, but I would like to go sometime with somebody back over to Saudi Arabia and to the Emirates and see this happen. I don't know. Maybe you've been there. I don't know how, I don't know what the procedure is, but I would sure like to do it. I think that'd be very exciting, and I'm very envious of those in the falconry community who might hear this podcast, who have the opportunity and take the time and have the money to go do that and watch that. I think they're really privileged, and I'm envious of that.
Well, like I said, I mean, we've covered all kinds of really awesome stuff in this episode, and before we call this good, I mean, I do want to get how I've been ending, a lot of these episodes for a while now is getting a good piece of advice or a sentiment, and to pass along to, not just necessarily falconers, but future generations of people that might be interested in research or other aspects of this world that we live in, as far as birds and falconry. And I mean, what's one of the more, I don't know, better pieces of advice you think you'd like to leave?
I'm a little skeptical of advice from people, but I would hope that it doesn't matter what your preferences are. It doesn't matter what your ethnicity is or what language you speak or what your politics are. But I would hope that everybody has a moral landscape that they make a judgment on and do what's correct and don't follow the sheep. Don't get caught up in some off-the-chart activity that doesn't require a moral conscience, that allows you to do anything you want to do. Because I think that the evolution of humans has gone so far as it has because we have had a moral conscience. And I hate to get sort of preachy about this, but I have a great respect for the evolution of humans and what we have gone through from the Stone Age up to now, where we're anatomically modern humans and the things we're doing, and the problems that we create that we wouldn't have to create. And I know this sounds kind of preachy, and I don't want it to be, but I am really one who's sold on people who do things that are morally correct, that they're proud of doing it because they did what was right. And I know that's not probably something you want to end with, but that's what comes to my mind.
No, that's fine. And like I said, it didn't have to be specific to, the one aspect of one thing or another. But I mean, that's fine. I mean, that, like I said, I mean, it's all, there's no right or wrong answer necessarily to the question. It's, like I said, I mean, everybody's got, as we kind of briefly talked about before in this conversation, I mean, everybody's got different ways they prioritize things.
Yeah.
And what they view as important.
Sure.
And that's what I wanted to hear from you. That's all. I mean, as far as what you value and what is important, what you think, is important also, that other people at least, should consider and look at as well. So
yeah, well, and I've seen colleagues that have not been honest with the data they have, but got it published so that they could get more money to publish some more. And that's what I'm trying to get at, is that people that do things just because of their egos or what they think they need, and they do the wrong things. They do the wrong things for the wrong reasons.
Right.
I've watched a lot of that in my profession.
Yeah, and there's not much integrity in that.
Yeah.
No, I get it. Yeah, and like I said, I mean, it's important, to not lose sight of the things that you really should be doing, as opposed to maybe what might not necessarily be easier, but is right. So no, I like it. And believe it or not, we actually are a little over 2.5 hours into this already. So,
really?
Yeah. Everybody's always shocked about how quick some of this stuff goes.
No one's going to listen to that.
You'd be surprised.
For that long.
There was a lot of good stuff in this. And like I said, thank you again very much for taking the time to allow me to come down, pay you a visit on such short notice. I know you don't know me from Adam, and thanks for letting me into your house to do this. And
well, I'm flattered that you would call me.
Yeah, no, like I said, I appreciate anybody that's willing to give me the time to share their experiences and all the different knowledge they've accumulated over the years. And yeah, you're no exception to that. You've done a lot of really really neat stuff over the years, and like I said, I appreciate you sharing it, and that's what's, like I said, that's the irony in all this for me. And I've mentioned this several times, but it's a bummer sometimes from my point of view that I don't get to do more of these with sometimes people like yourself, even multiple episodes and things, because 87 to 88 years, I mean, that's a lot of collective experiences and knowledge that you wish that you would be able to cover it all, but there's just no way in a couple of hours, you're going to be able to cover every little, thing or whatever, but I do my best. And I'm always happy whenever people are willing to give me whatever time they're willing to give me to share. And, hopefully everybody gets something out of it. And like I said, enjoys listening. So like I said, I appreciate you again. And are you getting hungry yet? I know I'm kind of getting a little hungry.
No, well, I've got family coming down for dinner tonight.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
So
yeah, I know I'm going to have to get something to eat soon. So I'll go ahead and wrap this up and let you get ready for your family to come in, and I'll be heading back shortly and putting more food in my belly, I guess. So,
okay.
But thanks very, very much again. And I look forward to seeing. I might take a couple of these pictures of these birds you're going to show me in a little bit.
Yeah, okay.
So, but thanks again. And hopefully this won't be the last time I get a chance to see you.
I hope not. Come back again.
Yeah,
do it. Yeah. Feel free to.
All right. Well, thank you again, and hopefully we'll talk again soon.
Good.